People go missing every day, and it's one of the worst things that can happen. Who knows what happens to them, and all we can do is think about it. These cases are awful, but they're interesting to learn about, so I compiled some here. My heart goes out to the families of all the victims here, and the victims themselves, of course. I just want to preface it with that. But let's get into this video. And we're gonna start with the disappearance of Rebecca Corium. On March 22nd, 2011, 24-year-old Rebecca Corium was working aboard the Disney Wonder cruise ship, which had just left Los Angeles and was headed toward Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. At 5:45 a.m., CCTV footage captured her in the crew lounge, wearing loose men's clothing, pacing and talking on an internal phone line. She looked visibly distressed. After that moment, Rebecca was never seen or heard from again. She didn't show up for her 9 a.m. shift. A search was launched on the ship, followed by a brief sweep of the surrounding waters by the Coast Guard and Mexican Navy. But there were no answers, no remains, and barely a trace. Almost immediately, Rebecca's family began to suspect that something was off about the official response. Her father, Mike Corium, said Disney never turned the ship around. The coordinates given to search crews may have even been wrong. Instead of US investigators, the case was handed over to the Royal Bahamas Police Force, because under cruise law, jurisdiction goes to the country where the ship is registered, not where it sails. That country in this case was the Bahamas, a known corporate tax haven. 3 days later, Disney flew out a single Bahamian detective, Paul Roll, on a private jet. He spent 1 day aboard the ship, interviewed 6 crew members, and 0 passengers out of more than 2,000 people on board. When Rebecca's parents arrived in Los Angeles to meet with Disney and the detective, they were brought through a back entrance with blacked out windows, ushered into a private room, and shown a carefully edited clip of their daughter pacing and talking on the phone. Then the captain shared his theory. Rebecca had been swept overboard by a rogue wave while walking on deck 5. To support this, Disney pointed to a sandal found on the deck near a crew pool. The family wasn't convinced. The wall on deck 5 was over 6 feet high. The weather had been calm, and the sandal they were shown wasn't even Rebecca's size, and had another crew member's name and cabin number written inside. From the start, Disney's official version of events had major holes. According to them, Rebecca was caught by a freak wave and thrown off the ship sometime between 6 and 9 a.m. But that would have required a 100-foot wave, something no other crew or passengers noticed, and something ocean conditions near Puerto Vallarta don't support. Then there's the CCTV footage. Disney claimed the video was taken near deck 5, close to where she supposedly went overboard. But when private investigator Roy Ram, a former Scotland Yard official, obtained the full footage, he realized it was actually shot on deck 1, nowhere near the supposed accident site. Not only that, but the timestamp and location had been cropped out when it was shown to the family. Other so-called evidence didn't hold up either. That sandal from deck 5 was not only the wrong size and style, it was confirmed by both crew and family to belong to someone else. Still, Disney treated the matter as closed. They even held a flower-laying ceremony on deck 5 for the media. But behind the scenes, it was a different story. Crew members were warned not to speak about what happened. When journalist John Ronson boarded the Wonder later that year, he found that most staff refused to talk. One finally admitted, "Disney knows exactly what happened. Everything here is taped. They have the tape." Another crew member just said, "I don't know anything. That's the answer I have to give." Then, in 2017, a new voice entered the story. Rebecca's former girlfriend, Tracy Medley. She said she and Rebecca had a tense emotional relationship, and the night before Rebecca disappeared, they had a threesome with a male crew member. Medley believed that guilt or heartbreak may have pushed Rebecca to take her own life. But Rebecca's family and longtime friends have strongly rejected that theory. It didn't make sense to them, not just because of her personality, but because of how sloppy and implausible the evidence was. Something else had to have happened. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more disturbing the surrounding details became. Only 6 crew members were interviewed. No passengers were questioned. No forensic investigation was conducted. Rebecca's parents were never allowed to see a full list of who was on board that morning. And yet somehow the official story was accepted by both Disney and the Bahamian authorities. A freak accident, case closed. But there were still loose threads, ones that Disney and law enforcement never explained. After the ship docked, Rebecca's parents went through her personal effects. Inside her cabin was a pair of ripped shorts, which investigator Roy Ram believed could point to a physical struggle or even a SA. Then came signs of digital activity. Months after her disappearance, someone had accessed her Facebook account. Her password had been changed. Her bank account showed activity. None of this made sense for someone presumed dead in the ocean. Crew members who had worked closely with her painted a more complex picture of Rebecca. Someone warm and bubbly, but with emotional depth and private struggles. A close friend aboard the ship told the BBC, "I was never spoken to by security or police at all. To call this an investigation is an insult." MP Chris Matheson later stated, "I believe there's sufficient evidence to indicate a crime may well have taken place. But the truth is, without real oversight or accountability, cruise lines have no incentive to dig deep. The Bahamas never reopened the case. Disney never released the footage. And Rebecca Corium, whose disappearance started with a panicked phone call in a crew lounge, simply became another ghost lost at sea." The Martin family. On the morning of December 7th, 1958, the Martin family left their home in Portland, Oregon for what should have been an uneventful Sunday outing. Kenneth and Barbara Martin, along with their 3 daughters, Barbie, aged 14, Virginia, 13, and Susan, 11, piled into their cream and red 1954 Ford Country Squire station wagon to gather Christmas greenery out in the Columbia River. Piled into their cream and red 1954 Ford Country Squire station wagon to gather Christmas greenery out in the Columbia River Gorge. The plan was festive and ordinary. They'd been at a holiday party the night before. Their son, Donald, 28, was away on the East Coast studying and serving in the Navy. At home, everything was left as if they'd be back for dinner. Laundry mid-cycle, dishes drying, lights off, but they never returned. Their last confirmed stops came from 2 witnesses. A gas station owner in Cascade Locks remembered them buying fuel around 4 p.m., then continuing east. A waitress at the Paradise Snack Bar in Hood River served them shortly after. At some point that evening, passing motorists claimed to see a car matching theirs, or maybe the family themselves, on the north bank of the Columbia River over the Washington border. That was odd because everything else had placed them on the Oregon side. Either they'd crossed the river at some point, or those witnesses were wrong. They were reported missing 2 days later after Kenneth didn't show up for work and the girls didn't show up to school. Police found no signs of struggle or departure at the house. Everything suggested they had intended to return, but the deeper that the police looked, the stranger things got, especially when they found a discarded handgun, 2 ex-cons, and a white car with California plates abandoned just miles from where the Martins were last seen. In the early days of the search, investigators were overwhelmed with tips. Hundreds of calls and letters poured in. One of the most significant came from Cascade Locks, near where the family had fueled up, where a stolen white 1951 Chevy was found abandoned. Not the Martin's car, but parked not far away, someone had ditched a bloody .38 Colt Commander in the bushes. That gun was eventually traced back to a Meyer and Frank department store, the same store where 2 years earlier Donald Martin had been fired for stealing sporting goods. Investigators never processed the gun for evidence. The next day, police arrested 2 men, Roy Light and another unnamed ex-con, for stealing that Chevy. One of them had been seen in the same restaurant as the Martins at the same time. They were also known to local waitstaff. The implication wasn't subtle. They may have followed the Martins out, or worse. Despite this, the case stagnated. Searches turned up nothing. Sightings trickled in from Iowa, Montana, even a canyon on native land where a man later saw buzzards circling, but nothing panned out. Then in February, a searcher discovered tire tracks leading straight off a cliff near the Dalles. Investigators found paint chips that matched the Ford. The FBI confirmed it was likely the same color and make. That cliff faced the Columbia River. Beneath it, murky, freezing water and a thick slit bed could have hidden a car for decades. In fact, the river was so deep that the Army Corps of Engineers lowered it 5 feet to look for the vehicle, and still nothing. Then, months later, the river did give something back. On May 1st, 1959, nearly 5 months after the Martins vanished, a drill rig working near the Dalles hooked onto something heavy in the water. It broke loose before they could pull it up. The next morning, a couple fishing near Bonneville Dam saw 2 bodies float past. They called authorities, who later recovered both from different points along the Columbia River. It was Virginia and Susan Martin. Their identities were confirmed by dental records. Susan's clothes were found laced with traces of metal, aluminum, possibly picked up near a smelting plant downriver. One technician quietly told the medical examiner they believed there were bullet holes in both girls' skulls, but the autopsy listed drowning, no mention of gunshots, no suspects, no answers. And this all happened so long ago that we don't really know for sure. We have to just go off the records. That same week, search divers returned to the spot by the cliff, the one with the matching tire tracks, but nearly lost a man in the current. The search was called off. Kenneth, Barbara, and Barbie's bodies were never found, neither was the car. And then everything went quiet for over 60 years. But in late 2024, diver and amateur investigator Archer Mayo changed that. He found what's believed to be the Martin station wagon, 50 feet down in the Columbia River, buried in silt and stone near the Cascade Locks. He recovered the frame, axle, and engine, still intact enough to be sent to the Oregon State Crime Lab. No bodies were found, no confirmation of foul play, but the car, the central clue Detective Walter Graven had always believed would solve the case, finally surfaced. To this day, there are still 2 theories. 1. The family drove off the cliff by accident. 2. They were murdered, pushed, or coerced, or killed beforehand. What haunts investigators is that the cliffside tire tracks appeared deliberate, as if the car had been forced off. Combined with the ex-cons, the bloody gun, the missing parents, and the gagged investigation, something about it has always felt unfinished, and maybe it still is. M.V. Joyita. On October 3rd, 1955, the MV Joyita finally left Apia Harbor in Samoa after a 17-hour delay caused by engine trouble. The boat was already in rough shape. Its license to carry paying passengers had elapsed, the port engine clutch was broken, and it left harbor running on only one engine. On board were 25 people, 16 crew members and 9 passengers, including a World War II surgeon named Dr. Alfred Parsons, a government official, and 2 children. They were headed 270 miles north to the Tokelau Islands with a cargo of medical supplies, timber, food, and 80 empty oil drums. The trip was supposed to take less than 2 days, but by October 6th, the port in Tokelau reported that Joyita was overdue. No distress call had been received. A massive search effort by the Royal New Zealand Air Force covered over 100,000 square miles of ocean and found nothing. For 5 weeks, the Joyita and everyone on board were simply gone. Then on November 10th, a merchant ship spotted her drifting over 600 miles west of where she should have been. The ship was half submerged, tilted heavily to one side, and completely abandoned. For Tons of cargo were gone. So were all the people. The Joyota was a wreck. Her superstructure was damaged, windows shattered, and a canvas awning had been set up like someone was trying to create shelter on deck. All the life rafts and dinghies were missing. So were the firearms, navigation tools, and the ship's logbook. Most chilling was a doctor's bag on deck with a scalpel, stethoscope, and blood-stained bandages inside. The electric clocks had all stopped at 10:25, and the radio was tuned to the International Distress Channel, but a hidden break in the antenna cable meant no message ever made it out. There was fuel in the tanks and evidence that Joyota had traveled most of the way to Tokelau before something happened, likely a flooding event in the engine room caused by a broken pipe. The bilge pumps were clogged with debris and couldn't remove the water. Still, despite the flooding, the boat's hull was sound. Joyota was lined with cork and filled with buoyant cargo. It couldn't sink, and yet everyone on board had abandoned her anyway. The most pressing question became, why would they leave a floating ship in the middle of the Pacific? The official maritime inquiry in 1956 blamed mechanical failure and bad decisions. They concluded that the ship began to flood because of the broken cooling pipe and the crew likely panicked when they couldn't stop it. But that still didn't explain the total disappearance. Even if they'd abandoned ship, why didn't anyone survive? Why take the navigation gear and guns? And why leave a nearly unsinkable ship for open rafts in the Pacific? One theory suggests that Captain Miller was injured or killed, maybe during a mutiny after the flooding began. Blood-stained medical tools back up the idea that someone was hurt. Some say the first mate took over and ordered everyone to evacuate. Others speculate they saw an island or reef and tried to reach it. Then there were the conspiracy theories. Japanese fishing boats hiding secret operations, Cold War abductions by Soviet submarines, pirates stealing the cargo, or even an insurance scam by the debt-ridden captain. But none of it ever stuck. The inquiry didn't even mention the medical gear. The Joyota was patched up and returned to service a year later, but her reputation was ruined. She ran aground multiple times, flooded again, and was eventually abandoned for good in the late 1950s. Her final owners tried turning her into a museum, then a tea shop. Neither plan lasted. She slowly disappeared, piece by piece, left to rot on the shore. By the late 1970s, there was nothing left. Despite no bodies, no confirmed cause, and no survivors, Joyota became a legend, dubbed the Mary Celeste of the South Pacific. Memorials were built in Samoa and Tokelau, stamps were printed, and a walkaway was named after Dr. Parsons. But the truth of what happened on that ship, and why 25 people vanished from a floating seaworthy ship, is still unsolved. The only thing left is the wreckage and the haunting silence of everything it didn't explain. Georgia Weckler. On the afternoon of May 1st, 1947, 8-year-old Georgia Jean Weckler was dropped off just a short walk from her front door. Her neighbor, Mrs. Carl Flork, had given her a ride home from school and watched Georgia paused at the mailbox, collected the day's letters, then turned down the gravel lane leading to the Weckler farmhouse in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. It was a half-mile walk, quiet and familiar, surrounded by open country. Georgia waved goodbye and disappeared up the drive. She was never seen again. By nightfall, Georgia's parents realized something was wrong and called the police. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in Wisconsin history at the time. Hundreds of neighbors and officials combed 10 square miles on foot, by car, and even on horseback. All they found were fresh tire tracks in the gravel, suggesting a black Ford sedan had sped away from the lane around the time Georgia was dropped off. The case quickly shifted from a missing child search to a suspected abduction. There was no ransom note, no confirmed sightings, and no explanation. Georgia's father went on the radio to plead for her return. Locals raised over $8,000 in reward money, a huge sum in 1947, but the investigation went cold fast. For years, police chased down tips and rumors, but nothing panned out. Then, in the 1950s, serial killer Ed Gein became a person of interest due to the horrific remains found on his Plainfield farm. Some wondered if Georgia had been an early victim. Plainfield wasn't impossible possibly far from Jefferson, but the timeline and victim profile didn't line up, and no evidence ever surfaced tying him to the case. It would take decades before the investigation found another real lead. In the early 2000s, Detective Leah Meyer reopened the case and began looking through old confessions and files. One name kept surfacing: Buford Sinnott, a violent offender arrested later in 1947 for a separate murder and SA in northern Wisconsin. Sinnott had confessed to Georgia Jean's kidnappings years prior, saying it had been a ransom attempt gone wrong. But like a lot of confessions, this one came up with contradictions. Sinnott claimed he and an unnamed accomplice took Georgia to a hideout after abducting her. According to him, she died accidentally after being given sleeping pills and her body was dumped in the Wisconsin River. The problem? He never signed the confession and his story didn't hold up under scrutiny. Detectives searched the alleged hideout and came up empty. Still, he knew details about the abduction that had never been made public, and the car he was driving at the time matched the one seen fleeing Georgia's neighborhood. Detective Meyer doesn't fully buy his version. She believes the story is part truth, part lie, possibly to protect someone, or simply to manipulate the narrative. What she does believe is that the kidnapping wasn't premeditated. Georgia had just been dropped off, and the timing would have required the offender to be passing by at that exact moment. Sinnott was paroled decades later, but went on to commit more sexual assaults and died in 2008. Despite renewed attention, Georgia Jean Weckler's disappearance remains unsolved. No body has ever been found. Johnny Gosch. It was still dark when Johnny Gosch left home that Sunday morning, September 5th, 1982. He was 12 years old, carrying out the paper route he'd done dozens of times before. Normally, his dad went with them, but for whatever reason, this morning Johnny went alone. Just him, the family dachshund Gretchen, and a little red wagon filled with newspapers. That wagon never made it far. 2 blocks from the house, it was found abandoned, still full. The dog came home on her own. Johnny never did. At first, the police didn't do much. Back then, Des Moines policy said a child had to be missing for 72 hours before they'd consider it serious. So when Noreen Gosch called in, panicked, and certain her son had been taken, she was told to wait. As far as the cops were concerned, Johnny was just another runaway. But anyone who knew him, including his parents, neighbors, and customers on his route, said that didn't make sense. Johnny was reliable. In fact, the very first sign something was wrong came just a couple hours later, when a customer called in to complain about not receiving their paper. That had never happened before. Johnny had just won a perfect service award from the Des Moines Register. It wasn't like him to miss a delivery. The only clues were subtle and easy to ignore if you weren't looking closely. A few rubber bands scattered on the pavement, the wagon untouched, no blood, no struggle, no one heard screams. But there were witnesses. One man, John Rossi, said Johnny came up to him that morning asking for help. He said a man in a blue two-tone car needed directions. Rossi saw the man and got a weird feeling. He even tried to memorize the license plate just in case. The man drove off after flashing his dome light 3 times, a weird detail that stuck with Rossi for decades. He'd later try hypnosis to recall the plate, but all he could remember was that it was from Warren County. Other paperboys said they saw someone following Johnny. A neighbor heard a car door slam, then a silver Ford Fairmont sped off, but that was it. No clear suspect, no license plate, no real leads, just a missing kid, a quiet street, and a growing list of people saying something's not right. 15 years after Johnny vanished, someone knocked on his mother's door. It was a freezing night in March 1997 around 2:30 in the morning, and Noreen Gosch says she got out of bed to find 2 men standing outside her apartment. One of them, she says, was Johnny, now 27 years old. She didn't need a test or proof. She looked at him and she just knew. Mothers always say that they recognize their kids no matter what. Johnny didn't let her call anyone. Not the police, not the FBI, not even her ex-husband. He said if she told anyone he'd be in danger. He didn't say from who. Instead, he opened his shirt and pointed to a birthmark on his chest, something that had been heavily reported in the years after his disappearance. For Noreen, though, that wasn't what convinced her. She already believed it was him. They talked for an hour and a half, or rather, Johnny talked carefully, always glancing over at the other man like he was waiting for permission. He wouldn't say where he was living, wouldn't say where he was going. He just told her to stay quiet and that if she called anyone, she'd be putting him at risk. Then, just as suddenly as they'd arrived, the two men left. She says she watched them walk off and she never saw them again. And then she said nothing. Not for 2 years. Noreen kept the whole thing to herself, scared that even speaking it out loud could put him in danger. She never even told her ex-husband, and for a woman who had spent the last decade pushing every media outlet, every investigator, and every government agency to take her son's case seriously, that silence says everything about how real she believed this visit was. When she finally told the story publicly in 1999, it wasn't just for attention. She was testifying under oath in a civil trial, one connected to a massive alleged trafficking ring. But the visit still splits people down the middle to this day. Some believe her, and some think she got conned. Even Johnny's father says he believes it was just another cruel impersonator. What happened after Johnny vanished was almost as strange as the disappearance itself. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still no real progress. Noreen Gosh quickly realized the police weren't going to solve this for her. They were slow to act from the start, treating her son like a runaway instead of a kid who was clearly taken. So she did what any desperate mother would do. She took control. Noreen hired her own private investigators, people who weren't afraid to chase leads that the local police wouldn't touch. Among them were Jim Rothstein, a retired NYPD detective, and Ted Gunderson, a former FBI agent. Their theory? Johnny hadn't just been kidnapped. He'd been taken by a child prostitution ring. It was an idea that sounded almost unthinkable at the time, but it was the only explanation that made sense to them. Official authorities denied there was any evidence of that, but Noreen believed otherwise. Then the nightmare repeated itself. In August 1984, another paperboy vanished. Eugene Martin, just 13 years old, disappeared on his route early on a Sunday morning. Same city, same setup, same eerie silence. Witnesses reported seeing Eugene talking to a strange man before he vanished. For Noreen, this was confirmation that the cases were linked, but the police still said it was all coincidence. And if that wasn't enough, in March 1986, yet another boy, Mark Allen, went missing on his way to a friend's house. Just like that, a city that barely wanted to believe one child could be taken now had 3 missing boys in less than 4 years. After the official investigation failed and private investigators hit a wall, the rest of the case played out in scattered moments. Weird sightings, cryptic messages, and people showing up out of nowhere claiming they had answers. Some of it was garbage, and some of it didn't feel like that. In 1985, Noreen and her husband got a letter from someone calling himself Samuel Forbes Dakota. He claimed Johnny had been kidnapped by a motorcycle club involved in human trafficking. According to his story, he'd personally guarded hundreds of kids and said that Johnny was sold off to a drug dealer in Mexico City. He asked for $11,000 to share more information. Noreen paid him. Then he asked for $100,000. She was ready to pay again, but before she could, the FBI caught him at the Canadian border. His real name was Robert Herman Meir. He was 19 years old. That meant he would have been 13 when the supposed trafficking ring trusted him to guard abducted children. The whole thing was a scam. But Noreen still believed him. She even criticized the FBI for arresting him, saying it ruined any chance Johnny had of being ransomed home. And just like that, the lines between hope and delusion kept getting harder to see. Then came Paul Bonacci. He was in prison in the early 90s for assault minor. He claimed not only to have been a victim of trafficking himself, but also to have helped kidnap Johnny. He described Johnny being held in a house in Sioux City, Iowa, then later spotted in Colorado. And when police gave him a lineup of sketches from the original 1982 investigation, he picked out the one that witnesses had described as Johnny's abductor without being prompted. That wasn't all. He described scars that had never been made public, one on Johnny's leg and another shaped like a horseshoe on his tongue. He even mentioned how Johnny would stutter when scared. The cops still didn't buy it. They said that Paul had an alibi. His siblings claimed he was in Nebraska the day Johnny disappeared, but Noreen believed him. And at this point, it was getting harder to dismiss her entirely. Then things got weirder. In 1983, a woman in Oklahoma said she saw two men chasing a young boy. The boy ran up to her and said, "Please, lady, help me. My name is John David Gosh." She reported it, but police chalked it up to a domestic situation. It wasn't until months later, when she saw Johnny's face on the news, that she realized who'd she'd seen. The Gosh family's private investigator followed up with the FBI, and they confirmed it was real. 2 years after that, in 1985, a woman in Sioux City got a dollar bill as change at a grocery store. Next to George Washington's face were the words, "I am alive, Johnny Gosh." 3 handwriting experts and Johnny parents said that it was his handwriting. That same year, a circulation manager at the Des Moines Register, the very paper Johnny had worked for, was arrested for sexually abusing young boys. The man had a list of over 2,000 names and numbers, mostly boys. He claimed it was for recruiting paper carriers. Noreen believed this was the smoking gun, proof that Johnny had been targeted. But again, there was no official link, no charges, no closure. And in 1990, a body turned up in Mexico. Early reports said it was Johnny Gosh. Noreen almost believed it, especially after remembering the earlier scam that claimed Johnny had been sold to a Mexican drug lord. But it wasn't him. It was another boy named John, middle initial E, Gosh, from Washington State. Same last name, same name phonetically. Born 2 weeks before Johnny, same age. He died in a drug-related shooting and somehow ended up dumped in a ditch across the border. By the late 2000s, Johnny Gosh had been gone for over 2 decades, but Noreen never gave up. And even if she never got her son back, her obsession with the case left a mark. In 1984, Iowa passed what became known as the Johnny Gosh Bill, a law that forced police to stop treating missing children like adults. No more 72-hour waiting period. If a kid vanished under suspicious circumstances, the investigation had to start immediately. That law spread to 7 other states. She testified in front of Congress. She went after groups like NAMBLA, and she pushed hard enough that her work helped lead to the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. But even decades later, the story still wasn't over. On September 1st, 2006, someone left a stack of black and white photographs on Noreen's doorstep. The pictures showed young boys tied up and gagged. One of them, she said, was Johnny, still 12 years old, still wearing the sweatpants he disappeared in. It looked like a breakthrough, finally something real. Then police got an anonymous letter. The sender claims the photos weren't of Johnny at all, just kids from Florida playing a game. The Des Moines PD contacted a Florida detective who supposedly investigated the photos years later. He backed the story, but when they asked for proof, a timestamp, a case report, anything, nothing came. To this day, only some of the boys in the pictures have ever been identified. On the 35th anniversary of Johnny's disappearance, the Iowa State Fair put his red wagon on display. The same one they found 2 blocks from home, still full of newspapers. His father, John, said his last memory with Johnny was at that same fair, and even while looking at that wagon, years later, he still didn't know if his son was dead or alive. John and Noreen divorced in '93, a few years before Noreen said Johnny came back. John never believed that story. He thinks it was a sick hoax, just another person pretending to be their son to mess with the grieving mother. Today, Johnny Gosh is still missing. Not declared dead, not found, still missing. What started as a routine paper route in a quiet city in Iowa became one of the most disturbing and mysterious cases in American history, and no one has ever been able to explain what really happened. And that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, let me know and leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe, join my Discord, follow my Instagram, all that stuff. Thank you for watching, guys. These are all disturbing and makes me feel so disgusting, but it's important to learn about them, and it is a little bit interesting. So anyways, good night everyone, and sweet dreams.